The cruelest thing about funerals is discovering who was already waiting for you to disappear next. I realized my husband's family had already erased me before the service had even started. The morning of Richard's funeral was cold and gray, the kind of Connecticut weather that made the entire world feel quieter than usual. The church parking lot was already full when my driver pulled up beside the stone entrance of St. Matthew's. Black umbrellas moved across the wet pavement like shadows, and for a moment, I just sat there staring through the tinted window at people who had spent 30 years smiling at me across dinner tables while secretly calculating what my husband would leave behind when he died. Richard Carter had been gone for only 4 days. 4 days since the hospital room. 4 days since I held his hand while the monitor flatlined. 4 days since the only man who had ever truly protected me took his last breath. And somehow, before the flowers around his casket had even begun to wilt, his family had already started acting as though I was the next thing to be removed from the estate. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 67 years old, and until that morning, I believed grief would be the hardest thing I would carry. I was wrong. The driver opened my door carefully. "Mrs. Carter," he said softly, offering his hand. I thanked him and stepped out slowly in my black wool coat and low heels. I could feel eyes on me immediately. Not sympathy. Assessment. The kind people give someone they think is about to lose everything. Richard's son Daniel stood near the church doors greeting guests. Beside him was his wife, Melissa, wearing a fitted black designer dress that probably cost more than most people's mortgage payments. She looked polished, composed, and almost irritated by the rain touching her hair. The moment she saw me walking toward them, her smile changed. Not completely, just enough for me to notice. "Evelyn," she said, kissing the air beside my cheek instead of touching me. "You made it." Made it. As though there had been some doubt his widow would attend the funeral. Daniel gave me a quick one-armed hug before glancing over my shoulder toward arriving guests. "You okay?" he asked distractedly. I nodded once. I wasn't interested in performing grief for people who were already emotionally inventorying Richard's possessions. Inside the church, candles flickered along the walls while a string quartet played softly near the altar. The scent of lilies filled the air so heavily it almost made my chest ache. I took a slow breath and looked toward the front pews where the family seating had been arranged. Then I stopped walking. My name wasn't there. I looked again, thinking perhaps I'd missed it through tears or exhaustion. But no. The reserved cards read, Daniel Carter, Melissa Carter, Lauren Carter, immediate family. My seat was nowhere at the front. One of the ushers approached awkwardly. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "your seat is back there." He pointed toward the middle rows beside distant relatives and family friends. For a few seconds, I genuinely couldn't move. 35 years married to Richard Carter, and somehow I had been removed from immediate family seating at his funeral. Melissa appeared beside me almost instantly, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. "Oh," she said with fake surprise, touching her chest lightly. There must have been confusion with the seating arrangement. We needed those front rows for Richard's real family. Real family. The words landed softly, but they cut deeper than shouting ever could. I looked at her carefully. She smiled back with perfect makeup and empty eyes. Around us, people pretended not to listen while hearing every word. Daniel noticed the tension and stepped closer. "It's just seating, Evelyn," he muttered under his breath. "Let's not make today harder than it already is." Harder for who? I wanted to ask. For the widow? Or for the people already trying to phase her out of the picture? But I said nothing. That was the moment Melissa relaxed. Because silence is often mistaken for weakness by people who have never had to survive anything difficult. I walked calmly to the middle pew and sat beside Richard's cousin Patricia, who squeezed my hand sympathetically without saying a word. Up front, Melissa adjusted flowers beside the casket like she was hosting a charity gala instead of attending a funeral. Daniel leaned toward one of Richard's business partners, already talking numbers in a low voice. I sat there quietly, staring at the polished mahogany casket beneath the church lights, listening to strangers describe my husband like he belonged to history now instead of to me. And somewhere between the opening hymn and the pastor's first prayer, I realized something chilling. They truly believed I was alone. They truly believed I had no power left. What none of them knew was that Richard had spent years preparing for this exact moment. The rain had stopped by the time the funeral service ended, but the air outside the church still carried that damp, Heavy chill that settles into your bones after a long day of pretending to be stronger than you feel. People gathered on the stone steps in clusters, speaking in soft voices while black umbrellas dripped onto the sidewalk. I stood near the edge of the crowd holding Richard's folded memorial card against my gloves, listening as strangers praised my husband's generosity, his intelligence, his discipline. Some of them sounded sincere. Others sounded like they were already rehearsing stories for future business dinners about the great Richard Carter and the fortune he built. Melissa moved through the crowd like she was hosting a social event instead of mourning her father-in-law. Every smile looked practiced. Every sympathetic expression disappeared the second someone turned away from her. I watched her place a hand gently on Daniel's arm while introducing him to one of Richard's old golf partners. "Daniel has a lot on his shoulders now," she said carefully. "There is so much to sort through financially. Financially, not emotionally, not spiritually, financially." It amazed me how quickly grief becomes paperwork when money is involved. Daniel nodded heavily like a man carrying a burden, but I knew that expression. Richard used to wear the same look during board meetings when he wanted people to underestimate how much control he already had. Except Daniel had never inherited his father's patience. He inherited his ambition without the discipline that made ambition respectable. As guests slowly began leaving the church, Melissa approached me again with that same polished smile. "We are all heading back to the house," she said. "You should ride with us. It is probably easier for you. Easier for me." Another subtle reminder that they already saw me as dependent. Fragile. A woman who would soon need assistance. "Thank you," I replied calmly. "I brought my own car." Her smile flickered for half a second. Tiny moments like that tell you more about people than arguments ever will. She wanted proximity because proximity creates control. Back at the estate, the atmosphere changed almost immediately. During the funeral, everyone had behaved carefully because public grief still required manners. But inside the Carter house, surrounded by imported marble floors and 40 years of accumulated wealth, people became comfortable again. Too comfortable. Caterers moved quietly through the kitchen setting out coffee, pastries, and trays of food no one was really hungry enough to eat. Family members drifted through the living room carrying wine glasses while pretending not to study the paintings, antiques, and furniture with fresh interest. Richard's cousin Harold stood near the staircase speaking softly to another relative. "Property taxes alone on this place must be unbelievable," he muttered. "I doubt Evelyn can maintain it herself." I kept walking as though I had not heard him. But I heard everything. Widows become invisible faster than people realize. Once society decides a woman is old and grieving, people stop filtering themselves around her. They assume she is too emotional to notice details or too broken to understand implications. Melissa entered the dining room carrying a folder in her hand. "Daniel and I were discussing some practical things," she announced casually. "Just temporary ideas while everyone adjusts." Temporary ideas. That phrase would repeat itself several times that afternoon. Temporary ideas about my future. Temporary ideas about my home. Temporary ideas about my finances. All discussed as though I were a guest in someone else's life instead of the woman who spent 3 decades helping Richard build everything around them. I sat quietly near the fireplace while conversations unfolded around me like theater. "The market is unpredictable right now," Daniel said while pouring himself bourbon. "Liquidating quickly might actually make the most sense." Melissa nodded thoughtfully, "Especially before maintenance becomes overwhelming." Then she looked directly at me with manufactured concern. "Large homes can become very difficult for someone alone." Someone alone. The room fell briefly silent after that. Not out of guilt. Out of curiosity. Everyone wanted to see how the widow would react. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and gave a small smile. "Richard always believed a home should belong to the person willing to protect it," I said softly. Melissa blinked once, clearly unsure what I meant. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly and changed the subject. But I noticed something important in that moment. They were confident because they believed I needed them. The second people think you are powerless, they stop hiding their intentions. Later that evening, I walked upstairs toward my bedroom while voices drifted up from the downstairs hallway. I stopped near the landing when I heard Melissa laughing quietly. "I mean, honestly," she whispered, "what is she going to do now?" Daniel answered in a lower voice. "Dad handled everything. She probably does not even know where half the accounts are." They both laughed softly after that. I stood there perfectly still with one hand resting against the banister Richard had designed himself 20 years earlier. The irony almost made me smile. Because what Daniel did not know was that Richard had trusted me with everything long before he stopped trusting anyone else. I barely slept that night. The house sounded different without Richard in it. For 35 years, there had always been some small sign of him somewhere after midnight. The low hum of his office television downstairs. Ice clinking in a glass when he could not sleep. The soft creak of floorboards outside our bedroom when he checked the doors before bed. Silence feels louder when you lose someone who filled every corner of your life. Around 3 in the morning, I walked downstairs wearing my robe and found myself standing in Richard's office. The room still smelled faintly of cedarwood and coffee, exactly the way it always had. His reading glasses sat neatly beside a stack of financial reports on the desk. One of his fountain pens rested beside a legal pad filled with notes written in his careful handwriting. Looking at it nearly broke me. Because unlike everyone else in that house, Richard had never once treated me like I was temporary. He trusted me long before he trusted his own son. I sat slowly in his leather chair and opened the bottom drawer of the desk. Inside was a small black key exactly where I knew it would be. Richard had shown me that drawer years ago during a winter storm when the power went out, and we spent the evening drinking coffee beside the fireplace. If anything ever happens to me, he had said quietly, do not let emotion make decisions for you. At the time, I laughed and told him he sounded dramatic. Richard rarely repeated himself, but that night he did. I mean it, Evelyn. The day I die, people will show you who they really are. Pay attention. I understand those words now better than I ever wanted to. I took the key upstairs and unlocked the small cabinet hidden behind the bookshelves in our bedroom sitting area. Inside sat several thick folders, a silver flash drive, and a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Richard's handwriting. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then I was right to prepare you. That sentence alone made my chest tighten. Richard always noticed things before anyone else did. He noticed when business partners became greedy. He noticed when friends became jealous. And apparently, he noticed the exact moment his own family started viewing him less as a father and more as an inheritance. I sat quietly beneath the lamp beside our bed and continued reading. Daniel loves comfort more than responsibility. Melissa loves status more than loyalty. Neither of them understands what it took to build this life. That is why everything important belongs to you now. I closed my eyes for a moment after reading that line. Not because I was surprised. Because I was sad he had seen this coming long before I did. Richard had spent years quietly restructuring everything. The investment accounts, the trusts, the commercial properties, even several private partnerships Daniel believed were still tied directly to the family company. Richard transferred them carefully and legally over time, protecting everything from exactly the kind of entitlement now unfolding downstairs. The only people who knew the full structure were Richard, our attorney Martin Keller, and me. Nobody else. Not even Daniel. Especially not Daniel. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the kitchen windows while Melissa stood beside the marble island speaking into her phone. I know, she whispered, thinking nobody could hear her. Once probate settles, we can finally renovate the Aspen Place. Aspen Place, Richard's vacation property in Colorado. Melissa was already redesigning homes she did not own. I entered the kitchen quietly and poured myself coffee while she ended the call quickly. Morning, she said too brightly. Did you sleep at all? Enough, I replied calmly. Daniel walked in moments later adjusting the cuff of his expensive watch. We should probably start organizing Dad's files today, he said. There is going to be a lot to untangle. Untangle. That word almost amused me. There was nothing tangled about Richard's estate. Every detail had been arranged with surgical precision. Daniel just did not know he had been written out of control long before the funeral flowers arrived. Melissa opened the refrigerator and glanced toward me carefully. We were also thinking maybe it would help if you downsized eventually. This house is almost 12,000 square feet. It is a lot for one person. I stirred cream into my coffee slowly before answering. Richard built this house for me. Melissa smiled politely. Of course. But things change. Yes, they do. That afternoon, after several relatives finally left the estate, I received a call from Martin Keller. Richard's attorney sounded calm as always. Mrs. Carter, he said gently, your husband requested the formal estate meeting happen Friday morning. Friday. Only 3 days. Away. Will Daniel be there? I asked. Martin paused briefly. He believes he will be leading the meeting. I looked across the living room, where Daniel sat reviewing property documents with the confidence of a man already spending money that did not belong to him. Then I glanced toward Melissa, measuring sections of wall space with her eyes like she was planning furniture placement. Neither of them noticed me watching. Neither of them understood the ground beneath their feet had already shifted. And for the first time since Richard died, I finally understood why he told me silence could be more powerful than anger. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of forced politeness wealthy families use when they are trying to disguise greed as concern. Melissa insisted we all sit down together for what she called a quiet family dinner before the estate meeting the next morning. The dining room glowed under crystal chandeliers while rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking the back lawn. Richard used to love this room during the holidays. He believed meals should make people feel close to one another. Looking around that table now, I realized proximity and closeness were not the same thing at all. Melissa had arranged everything carefully. Candles, white roses, expensive wine breathing beside polished silverware. To anyone outside the family, it would have looked elegant and warm. But underneath all that luxury sat tension sharp enough to cut through glass. Daniel sat at the head of the table where Richard used to sit. I noticed that immediately. Some people inherit positions before they earn them. Melissa poured wine for everyone except me before pausing with the bottle in her hand. "Oh," she said sweetly, "I forgot you have not really been drinking lately." I looked at the nearly empty glass in front of me and smiled faintly. "You forgot very quickly," I replied calmly. For a moment, silence settled across the table. Melissa laughed lightly as though I had made a joke. "Of course. It has just been such a stressful week." Stressful. The word sounded almost insulting sitting beside fresh grief. During dinner, the conversation drifted toward business almost. Immediately, Daniel spoke about restructuring parts of Richard's company. Melissa discussed possible renovations to the Aspen property again. Even Richard's cousin Harold joined in, asking whether the Nantucket house would remain in the family or be sold. Nobody asked how I was sleeping. Nobody asked whether I had eaten properly since the funeral. Nobody asked what Richard's death felt like after 35 years of marriage. To them, I had quietly shifted categories. I was no longer Evelyn. I was the widow attached to unresolved assets. At one point, Melissa glanced around the table and smiled carefully. Honestly, Richard would probably want everyone to move forward instead of staying emotionally stuck. Emotionally stuck. As though mourning my husband was some kind of inconvenience delaying their access to luxury real estate. Daniel nodded while cutting into his steak. Dad always believed practical decisions mattered more than emotional ones. I nearly laughed hearing that. Richard had been practical, yes. But people who only understand money never recognize the emotional intelligence required to protect it properly. The dinner continued with the strange calm that exists right before storms arrive. Then Melissa made a mistake. A fatal one. She stood from the table and disappeared briefly into the kitchen before returning with several folders tucked neatly under her arm. "Actually," she said casually, "while everyone is together, there are a few small things we thought might help Evelyn tomorrow." My eyes moved slowly toward Daniel. He avoided looking directly at me. "Interesting." Melissa placed the folders beside my plate and opened one carefully. "Just temporary authorization forms," she explained. "Nothing serious." I looked down at the paperwork. Power of attorney, property management authorization, temporary financial oversight permissions. Temporary. That word again. Melissa folded her hands together politely. "We just thought with everything happening, it might ease some pressure off your shoulders." I turned another page slowly while the room watched me. They truly believed grief had made me incapable of understanding what sat in front of me. "You want control over my accounts," I said quietly. Melissa's smile tightened slightly. "Not control. Assistance." Daniel finally spoke up. "Nobody is trying to take advantage of you, Evelyn." The irony of that statement nearly took my breath away. Richard spent years warning me about moments exactly like this. Not dramatic betrayals. Not screaming arguments. Quiet paperwork across polished dinner tables. Melissa leaned closer with soft concern painted across her face. "You should not have to manage all this alone at your age." At your age? There it was. The assumption beneath everything. Old means vulnerable. Grieving means weak. Silence means unaware. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back onto the tablecloth. I appreciate your concern, I said evenly. But I do not sign documents I have not reviewed with my attorney. Melissa blinked once. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It is standard paperwork, he insisted. Then my attorney will confirm that tomorrow, I answered. The atmosphere around the table changed immediately after that. Not openly hostile, just colder. Melissa reached for her wine glass a little too quickly. Daniel stared down at his plate longer than necessary. Across from me, Harold quietly excused himself from the table altogether. They had expected confusion, vulnerability, dependence. Instead, they encountered resistance wrapped in calmness. And calm people are difficult to manipulate because they force impatient people to expose themselves. After dinner, I walked alone into the back hallway near Richard's office. The house had gone mostly quiet except for muffled voices still drifting from the dining room. Then I heard Melissa whisper sharply from behind the partially closed door. She knows more than we thought. Daniel answered in frustration. She has no idea how complicated Dad's finances were. I stood silently in the dark hallway listening to them underestimate me again. What neither of them understood was that Richard had never hidden complexity from me. He had hidden it from them. And by tomorrow morning, they were finally going to understand the difference. Friday morning arrived colder than the rest of the week. The sky above Hartford looked pale and colorless as though the entire city had been drained of warmth overnight. I dressed carefully in a charcoal wool suit Richard once bought for me during a trip to New York nearly 10 years earlier. You look powerful in gray, he had told me back then with that quiet smile of his. At the time, I thought he was complimenting my appearance. Now I think he was teaching me something about perception. Power rarely announces itself loudly. By the time I walked downstairs, Daniel and Melissa were already waiting near the front entrance. Melissa carried a leather folder pressed tightly against her chest, while Daniel checked his watch every few minutes with restless impatience. Neither of them looked particularly sad anymore. They looked eager. Martin scheduled the meeting for 10 sharp, Daniel said as soon as he saw me. Apparently there are a lot of documents. Apparently. I almost smiled at the word. He still believed this was a normal estate meeting. He still believed he understood the structure of his father's finances. The drive into downtown Hartford was quiet except for Melissa occasionally mentioning practical details she clearly wanted me to overhear. The Aspen property taxes are due next quarter, she said casually. And I think the Nantucket house may need renovations before summer season. Daniel nodded. We should also evaluate which assets make sense to liquidate early. We should. The confidence in those two words fascinated me. People become remarkably possessive over things they have not earned. Martin Keller's law office occupied the top floor of a polished granite building overlooking the Connecticut River. Richard trusted Martin for nearly 25 years because he believed good attorneys should speak carefully and reveal information slowly. As we entered the reception area, Martin's assistant greeted me warmly. Mrs. Carter, she said gently, Mr. Keller is ready for you. For you. Not for all of us. Daniel noticed that too. Inside the conference room, everything smelled faintly of coffee, leather, and old paper. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the gray skyline, while a long walnut table stretched across the center of the room. Martin stood near the windows holding several thick binders. His silver hair looked slightly more tired than usual, but his expression remained calm the moment he saw me. Evelyn, he said quietly, stepping forward to shake my hand. I am very sorry for your loss. Unlike most people that week, he sounded sincere. Daniel immediately moved toward the head of the table before stopping awkwardly when Martin remained standing. Melissa sat beside him, already uncapping a pen like she expected to take notes during a corporate acquisition meeting. Martin waited until everyone settled before opening the first binder slowly. Before we begin, he said carefully, Richard left very specific instructions regarding the order in which this meeting would proceed. Daniel leaned back confidently. Makes sense, he replied. Dad always liked structure. Martin looked directly at him for several seconds before continuing. Yes, he did. There was something in Martin's tone that made the room subtly colder. He opened another folder and adjusted his glasses. First, I would like to clarify that a significant portion of Richard Carter's holdings were restructured over the past 7 years. Daniel frowned slightly. Restructured how? Martin folded his hands together. Into private trusts, controlled partnerships, and protected beneficiary accounts. Melissa immediately straightened in her chair. Protected from what? Martin answered without emotion. Potential disputes regarding ownership and succession. I watched Daniel carefully at that moment. For the first time all week, uncertainty flickered across his face. Small, brief, but visible. Dad never mentioned that, he said slowly. Martin looked down at the documents. Richard intentionally kept portions of his estate confidential. Silence settled across the room. Outside the windows, rain began tapping softly against the glass again. Melissa forced a tight smile. Well, I am sure everything still flows through normal inheritance channels eventually. Martin did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned another page and slid several documents across the table toward me. Mrs. Carter, he said calmly, these require your review before we continue. Daniel's head turned sharply toward me. Your review, he repeated. Martin nodded once. As controlling beneficiary, yes. The room became very still after that. Melissa stared at Martin like she had misheard him entirely. I am sorry, she said carefully. Controlling beneficiary of what exactly? Martin removed his glasses slowly. Of the Carter family trusts, the investment portfolios, the commercial property holdings, and the executive voting interests connected to Carter Industrial Logistics. Daniel laughed once under his breath. Not because anything was funny, because his mind could not process what he had just heard. That is impossible, he said flatly. Martin calmly opened another folder. No, Daniel. It is legally documented. Melissa looked toward me then, really looked at me for the first time all week. Not like an aging widow, not like a burden, not like someone dependent on their generosity. She looked at me like she suddenly realized she had been speaking carelessly around someone far more dangerous than she understood. And the meeting had only just begun. For several seconds after Martin finished speaking, nobody in the conference room moved at all. The silence felt almost unnatural, like the moment after lightning strikes before thunder finally reaches you. Daniel stared across the table at the documents in front of him as though they had been written in another language. Melissa looked between Martin and me repeatedly, waiting for someone to laugh and explain there had been some misunderstanding. But there was no misunderstanding. There was only reality arriving later than they expected. Martin adjusted the papers carefully and continued speaking in the same calm professional tone that had guided billion-dollar negotiations for decades. As of the final restructuring completed 18 months ago, Mrs. Carter became the sole controlling beneficiary of the Carter Legacy Trust. He slid another document across the polished walnut table toward Daniel. This includes the Hartford commercial portfolio, the Aspen property, the Nantucket residence, multiple investment accounts, and controlling shares in Carter Industrial Logistics. Daniel picked up the papers quickly, scanning line after line with growing disbelief. No, he said flatly. No, this cannot be right. Martin folded his hands. It is entirely correct. Melissa leaned forward sharply. Richard would never cut his own son out. Martin looked directly at her. He did not cut Daniel out entirely. There are secondary distributions scheduled under specific conditions. Daniel looked up immediately. What conditions? Martin opened another folder slowly. Continued board participation, financial responsibility reviews, and compliance with trust oversight regulations established by Mrs. Carter. Mrs. Carter. The room changed every time those words were spoken now. Not Evelyn. Not Richard's widow. Mrs. Carter. The controlling authority sitting quietly at the far end of the table while everyone else tried to understand how badly they had miscalculated her. Melissa's face tightened beneath her carefully maintained composure. Oversight, she repeated carefully. You mean Evelyn controls access to the distributions? Martin nodded once. Correct. Daniel laughed again, but this time there was frustration underneath it. Dad would never leave me dependent on approval like some teenager asking for allowance money. Martin's expression never changed. Your father's exact wording was that wealth without discipline destroys families. I looked down briefly at the polished table because hearing Richard's philosophy spoken aloud still affected me more than I wanted anyone to see. He believed money revealed character faster than hardship did. Hardship makes people survive. Money gives them room to become who they truly are. And right now, Daniel and Melissa were revealing themselves faster than either of them realized. Melissa straightened in her chair and forced another measured smile. I think emotions are probably affecting how all of this is landing today. Her voice sounded smooth again, practiced. Obviously, everyone here wants what Richard wanted. Martin turned one page quietly. Richard left additional written instructions regarding that concern. He removed a folded document from the binder and handed it directly to me. He requested that you read this portion personally if necessary. My fingers moved carefully across the paper as I unfolded it. Richard's handwriting stared back at me immediately. Strong, precise, familiar enough to tighten my throat. Evelyn, if they begin treating you like an obstacle instead of family, do not protect them from consequences. The room stayed silent while I read the sentence twice in my mind. Melissa finally spoke. What does it say? I folded the paper slowly and looked at Martin instead of answering. He understood immediately. Richard anticipated potential disputes regarding estate expectations. He explained evenly. That is why he consolidated authority under Mrs. Carter's discretion. Daniel pushed his chair back slightly. This is insane. No, I said quietly for the first time since the meeting began. It is organized. Both of them looked at me immediately. I kept my voice calm because calmness unsettles guilty people more than anger ever does. Your father spent years building something valuable, I continued. He was not careless enough to leave it vulnerable. Daniel stared at me in disbelief. You knew about this? There it was. The real shock underneath everything else. Not the money, not the trusts. The fact that I had known all along. I met his eyes steadily. Your father trusted me. Melissa crossed her arms tightly now. So all week you just sat there pretending to be helpless? Pretending. Interesting word. I thought back to the funeral seating. The whispered conversations. The power of attorney forms. The comments about my age, my future, my supposed dependents. Nobody forced them to reveal themselves. They volunteered that information freely because they believed I had no leverage. I never pretended to be anything, I answered calmly. You simply made assumptions. Daniel stood and walked toward the windows overlooking the river below. His reflection stared back at him through the gray rain outside. How much? He asked finally without turning around. Martin answered before I could. Current combined valuation places the estate at approximately $28 million, excluding future market growth. $28 million. The number landed heavily across the room. Melissa inhaled sharply beside him. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. And suddenly, every moment from the past week rearranged itself inside their minds. The funeral seating, the patronizing concern, the paperwork, the whispered conversations they assumed I could not hear. All of it now looked very different viewed through the reality sitting in front of them. Melissa slowly lowered herself back into her chair. My God, she whispered under her breath. But what struck me most was not their shock. It was fear, because for the first time since Richard died, they finally understood something important. The woman they had treated like a burden was now the most powerful person in the room. The energy inside the conference room shifted completely after the number was spoken aloud. $28 million has a strange effect on people. It strips away performance. Manners become thinner. Smiles become calculations. And suddenly every word spoken during the previous week starts echoing back differently inside guilty minds. Daniel remained standing near the windows with both hands pressed against his hips, while rain streaked slowly down the glass behind him. Melissa sat perfectly still beside the table, but I noticed her fingers tightening around the stem of her water glass hard enough to turn her knuckles pale. Neither of them knew what to say because the story they had created in their heads had collapsed too quickly. They thought they were preparing to manage a grieving widow. Instead, they had walked into a room where they themselves were financially dependent. Martin calmly organized another stack of documents while the silence stretched longer. Finally, Daniel turned around sharply. So what exactly happens now? He asked. The confidence in his voice had weakened noticeably. Martin answered with professional calm. Now the estate transitions according to Richard's instructions, meaning Evelyn controls everything, Melissa said quietly. There was bitterness underneath her words now, not hidden anymore. Martin corrected her carefully. Mrs. Carter oversees all primary holdings and trust. Distributions, yes. Melissa laughed once under her breath. Unbelievable. I looked at her calmly across the table. What exactly is unbelievable? Her eyes met mine immediately. You knew all along, she said. You let everyone think. She stopped herself before finishing the sentence. Poor, weak, helpless, old. I completed the sentence silently in my own mind because those were the assumptions hanging underneath every interaction since Richard died. Daniel walked back toward the table slowly. Dad should have told me, he muttered. He did tell you things, I answered quietly. You just never listened unless money was attached. The room fell silent again after that. Daniel stared at me with a mixture of anger and disbelief. I recognized the expression immediately because I had seen versions of it many times over the years whenever Richard denied him access to something he had not earned yet. Daniel always believed proximity entitled him to ownership. Richard spent decades trying to teach him otherwise. Melissa crossed her arms tightly. This feels manipulative. I almost smiled hearing that word from the woman who placed power of attorney forms beside my dinner plate less than 12 hours earlier. Martin adjusted his glasses again. Richard documented every decision extensively, he said evenly. Nothing about this structure is emotional or impulsive. Then he paused briefly before adding. In fact, he revised portions of the trust after observing increasing financial pressure from extended family members over recent years. Melissa's expression changed instantly. She understood exactly what that meant. Richard had noticed her behavior long before his death. Daniel sat back, down heavily in his chair. So what? He asked bitterly. I ask permission now every time I want access to family assets. I folded my hands together calmly. No, Daniel. You demonstrate responsibility. He shook his head slowly. This is insane. No, I repeated softly. This is accountability. Martin slid another document toward him. Your father established annual review conditions tied to investment behavior, debt exposure, and discretionary spending. Melissa leaned closer. Immediately. Debt exposure? Martin nodded. Richard had concerns regarding financial sustainability. A sharp silence followed that statement because everyone in the room understood what he was referring to. The luxury cars, the private club memberships, the designer renovations, the vacations carefully curated for social media photographs. Richard noticed everything, even when he said very little aloud. Melissa suddenly looked at me differently again, not just with fear this time, with resentment. Because she finally understood something humiliating. Every polite conversation she had during the funeral week had happened under a completely false assumption. Every patronizing smile, every comment about downsizing, every whispered discussion about my future. I had heard all of it while fully aware they possessed no actual authority over me at all. You could have told us, Melissa said quietly. Could I? I asked. Before the funeral, you removed me from immediate family seating. Her face flushed slightly. Daniel looked down at the table. I continued calmly because once truth begins, it becomes easier to finish. At dinner, you asked me to sign financial control documents before Richard had even been buried a full week. Neither of them interrupted. You discussed moving me out of my own home while standing beneath the roof Richard and I built together. Melissa's voice came out smaller now. We were trying to help. I held her gaze steadily. No. You were trying to prepare for ownership. The room became painfully quiet after that. Even Martin stopped turning pages. Outside, thunder rolled faintly somewhere across the city. Daniel rubbed one hand across his face slowly before speaking again. You really think that little of us? The sadness in his voice affected me more than the anger did because somewhere underneath all of this was still the little boy Richard once carried on his shoulders through this same city decades ago. But grief does not erase truth. No, I answered honestly. Your father did. That sentence landed harder than anything else spoken all morning. Daniel stared at me silently while Melissa looked away entirely. Because deep down they both knew Richard had seen them clearly long before I did. And for the first time since the funeral, neither of them looked powerful anymore. They looked exposed. The drive back to the estate felt completely different from every drive before it. Nobody spoke much during the first 20 minutes. Rain moved steadily across the windshield while Hartford traffic crawled beneath a gray afternoon sky. Daniel sat beside the driver staring down at his phone without actually reading anything on the screen. Melissa looked out the passenger window with her jaw tight and shoulders rigid, replaying the meeting over and over inside her head. I sat quietly in the back seat watching both of them through the reflection in the glass. Fear changes people faster than grief ever does. By the time we reached the house, the atmosphere inside the Carter estate had become strangely careful. The same halls where Melissa once walked confidently now felt quieter beneath her heels. The same living room where Daniel discussed liquidating assets now carried the tension of uncertainty. They finally understood they were no longer speaking as future owners. They were speaking as people whose lifestyle depended entirely on the judgment of the woman they had spent a week underestimating. I walked into Richard's office for the first time since the attorney meeting and closed the door behind me. The room still carried his presence so strongly that sometimes I expected him to look up from behind the desk and ask how the meeting went. Instead, there was only silence and a stack of documents Martin had arranged for my review later that evening. I sat slowly in Richard's chair and opened the top folder. Trust evaluations, distribution conditions, asset protection strategies. Richard had planned every detail with frightening precision. But buried beneath all the financial structure was something else entirely. A message. He wanted me protected from exactly this kind of humiliation. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Before I answered, Melissa opened the door carefully and stepped inside. Her entire posture had changed since that morning. Gone was the polished superiority from the funeral. Gone was the quiet condescension. Now she looked cautious. "Do you have a minute?" she asked softly. I closed the folder in front of me. Of course. She walked farther into the office, glancing around like she had never truly seen the room before. Maybe she had not. Some spaces only reveal themselves when power changes hands. Melissa folded her arms lightly. "I think we got off on the wrong foot this week." Wrong foot. An interesting phrase for people who tried to move me out of my own life before the funeral flowers even died. I remained calm. "Did we?" She exhaled carefully. "Everyone has been emotional." Emotional people do not usually prepare financial authorization forms during morning dinners, I answered quietly. Her face tightened briefly before smoothing again. "That was never meant to insult you." I looked at her steadily. But it did. Silence settled between us. Melissa shifted uncomfortably beneath my gaze for the first time since I had known her. Then she surprised me by dropping the polished social mask entirely. "I honestly did not think you understood how much Richard was worth," she admitted softly. There it was. Truth finally stripped clean of etiquette. "I helped him build it," I replied. "Every major decision for 35 years passed through this room." Melissa looked genuinely unsettled hearing that. I do not think she had ever imagined me as anything beyond Richard's quiet wife. She never understood that quiet women often know the most because people underestimate them long enough to speak freely around them. Later that evening, Daniel knocked on the office door next. Unlike Melissa, he looked exhausted instead of strategic. He sat across from me heavily and rubbed both hands together for several seconds before speaking. "Dad really did not trust me, did he?" The sadness in his voice sounded real now. Not defensive, not angry, just wounded. I answered honestly because lies would serve no purpose anymore. "Your father loved you very much." Daniel looked down. "That is not what I asked." I studied him quietly before continuing. "Your father worried that money came too easily to you." He nodded once without arguing. That told me more than words could have. "Melissa thinks you are going to cut us off completely," he admitted after a while. "Are you?" I thought about the funeral seating, the conversations about nursing homes, the patronizing comments about my age, the signatures they almost convinced themselves I would hand over. Then I thought about Richard's letter. "Do not protect them from consequences." "No," I answered calmly. "I am not interested in revenge." Daniel looked relieved for half a second until I continued speaking. "But consequences and revenge are not the same thing." His expression hardened again slightly. "Meaning?" I folded my hands together on top of Richard's desk. "Meaning people should live with the reality they created." Daniel stared at me silently. I could almost see him replaying the week inside his own head now the same way Melissa had earlier. Every dismissive glance, every assumption, every conversation spoken carelessly around me because they believed I had become powerless the moment Richard died. Finally, he stood slowly from the chair. "I do not know how to fix this," he admitted quietly. I looked toward the rain falling outside the office windows. "Neither do I," I answered truthfully. And that was the hardest part of all, because money can protect homes, businesses, and reputations. But once respect disappears inside a family, even $28 million cannot fully buy it back. 6 months after Richard's funeral, I sold the Connecticut estate quietly. No dramatic announcements. No family arguments. No public scenes. Just paperwork signed in silence beneath the same gray skies that seemed to follow the Carter family all winter long. The house sold to a private investment couple from Boston who admired the architecture and waterfront acreage. I watched movers carry out decades of furniture, photographs, books, and memories while standing beside the long circular driveway Richard once insisted should feel welcoming instead of intimidating. A home should never make people feel small, he used to say. I thought about that often after he died because somewhere along the way, too many people inside that house forgot the difference between success and superiority. I kept only what mattered. Richard's letters, his watches, the old leather chair from his office, a box of photographs from the years before money complicated everyone around us. Then I left Connecticut behind entirely. I bought a smaller coastal home outside Bar Harbor, Maine, where mornings smelled like salt water and pine instead of polished marble and expensive perfume. The house overlooked the Atlantic from a quiet cliffside road lined with white hydrangeas and weathered stone walls. Nothing about it looked flashy. That was intentional. Peace rarely announces itself loudly either. Most mornings now begin with coffee on the back porch wrapped in a sweater while fog rolls slowly across the ocean. Sometimes I still talk to Richard out there. Grief changes shape with time, but it never fully leaves. It simply becomes quieter, the same way love does. Daniel called several times during the first month after the estate meeting. At first, the conversations sounded careful and apologetic. Then they became practical again. Questions about trust distributions, business approvals, property access. I answered politely but consistently. Accountability remained exactly where Richard intended it to remain. Eventually, the calls became less frequent. Melissa only called once directly. Her voice sounded softer than I had ever heard it before. I know you probably hate me, she admitted during that conversation. I stood at my kitchen window overlooking the Atlantic while listening to waves crash against the rocks below. No, I answered honestly. I think you were too focused on what Richard owned to notice who he was. She became very quiet after that. A month later, I learned they sold the Aspen property voluntarily after realizing the maintenance costs and financial restrictions attached to the trust made it unrealistic to keep. The luxury SUV Melissa once drove disappeared from social media photographs shortly after. Their lifestyle adjusted quickly once easy access to money disappeared. Richard predicted that too. But despite everything, I never cut Daniel out entirely. That would have been punishment. Richard did not want punishment. He wanted responsibility. There is a difference. Every quarterly review forced Daniel to participate directly in the company his father spent 40 years building. For the first time in his life, he actually learned how much discipline wealth requires to survive across generations. Slowly, something about him began changing. Not dramatically. Real growth rarely happens dramatically. But the entitlement softened. The impatience faded. Sometimes pain is the only thing strong enough to interrupt arrogance. One afternoon in early autumn, Daniel visited Maine unexpectedly. He stood awkwardly on my front porch wearing jeans and an old navy sweater Richard once gave him years earlier. The ocean wind pushed lightly against both of us while gulls cried somewhere above the cliffs. "This place feels peaceful," he said quietly after stepping inside. "That is because nobody here is competing with each other," I answered. We sat on the porch for nearly an hour drinking coffee, without discussing money once. Eventually, he looked out toward the water and spoke softly. "I keep thinking about the funeral." I stayed silent. I should have stopped Melissa when she moved your seat. The honesty in his voice sounded heavier than apology. "Yes," I replied gently. "You should have." He nodded slowly. "Dad knew exactly who everyone was before he died, did he not?" I looked toward the ocean where fog drifted low across the horizon. "Richard understood people very well," I said, "especially when money was involved." Daniel stared into his coffee for a long moment before speaking again. "I think he trusted you because you never loved him for what he could give you." That sentence nearly broke my heart because it was the closest Daniel had come to understanding his father completely. After he left that evening, I walked down toward the cliffs alone carrying one of Richard's old letters folded inside my coat pocket. The wind smelled cold and clean as waves crashed endlessly below the rocks. I unfolded the paper carefully beneath the fading sunset and read the final line again. "Silence is not surrender, Evelyn. Sometimes it is strategy." I stood there for a long time listening to the ocean and thinking about how quickly people mistake kindness for weakness once they believe an older woman no longer holds power. At Richard's funeral, They looked at me and saw someone fragile, someone dependent, someone already fading into the background. What they never understood was that dignity does not become smaller with age. And a woman who survives betrayal quietly can become far more powerful than anyone notices until it is too late.